All right, y'all. I just got about 20 minutes into recording and realized I was not sharing my screen, so we will just start over. Okay. It's fun times. Okay. All right. So, welcome everyone. This lecture is our introduction to couple and family therapy, chapter 1 in your Murdoch text. So, before we really dive in, I want you to hear something important right from the start. This course is much less about fixing people and much more about understanding relationships. So, family therapy asks us to fundamentally shift how we think about problems. And instead of asking, what is wrong with this person? We begin asking, what is happening in the system? And so, that shift from individual pathology to relational patterns is the backbone of everything we will do this semester. So, if you keep that one idea in mind, you will be well grounded as we move forward. All right. So, I want to know what your thoughts are on family. So, I'm just going to kind of put some questions up here and we can talk about them in class. Um, but I want to begin with questions rather than answers because family therapy is deeply personal. So when you hear the word family, what comes to mind? Is family defined by biology? Is it defined by choice? Is it defined by who raised you or by who shows up for you now? And what about couples? Do couples have to be married? Do they have to be long term? Do they have to be romantic, sexual? These questions don't have one correct answer, and your answers may change over time, and that's okay. So now I want you to think briefly about your own family. You do not need to analyze or judge it, just notice it. So, what did healthy look like in your family growing up? How was conflict handled? How was emotion expressed or avoided? And who held responsibility for keeping the peace? So, when families are described as dysfunctional or unhealthy, where does the pain show up, or where do you think it shows up? Is it really contained within one person, or does it live between people in relationships? So, one of the core ideas of family therapy is this: individual healing and family healing are connected, but they are not the same. So, you can gain tremendous individual insight and still feel stuck in the same relational patterns. All right, so navigating a relational system, right? You'll see I have a YouTube link here for you. This idea of navigating a relational system is foundational to family counseling. You do not exist in a vacuum, and neither do your clients or your students. You are always responding to someone, reacting to something, and adjusting to patterns that existed long before you arrived. Families are living, breathing systems. They adapt, they resist change, and sometimes they work very hard to stay exactly the same, even when that same is very painful. So, as counselors, we are not stepping into only one person's story. We are stepping into a web of interactions. And so, I have this YouTube video that we'll all watch together in class just to kind of get us grounded in the material and kind of get us thinking systemically when we begin class in our next meeting. But so you don't have to worry about watching this on your own. But it's about a 15-minute TED Talk, and we'll just watch it all together. All right, so where it all started, the history, right? Family therapy emerged in the 1940s and 50s alongside some early ideas that we now know that we recognize as deeply flawed. Researchers from the Palo Alto Group and the Mental Research Institute, people like Jay Haley and Virginia Satir, they studied families of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia. So think California, the Bay Area in the, 40s and 50s. This is where family counseling really got started to gain traction, that research. So unfortunately, these early theories often blamed parents, especially mothers. You may encounter terms like the over-involved mother or the emotionally distant father, or even the deeply problematic idea of the schizophrenogenic mother. And you may have heard about the schizophrenogenic mother if you were a psych major in undergrad and maybe you took an abnormal psych class. You may have talked a little about this. But essentially, it was just blaming schizophrenia on the how they were raised by their mother, right? But we know that that is not true. So it's important to understand this history, not because it was correct, but because it reminds us of how theory is shaped by culture, power, and bias. So today we know schizophrenia is a brain disorder. Families do not cause it. However, families do influence how symptoms are experienced, managed, and understood. All right, so the next key term we'll talk about is double binds. So, one concept from this early work that still matters today is the idea of double bind. A double bind is essentially a no-win situation. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So, for example, you might get the message of be independent, but don't leave me, or tell me how you feel, but don't hurt my feelings. Double binds create anxiety, confusion, and emotional paralysis because there's no right answer. So over time, people stop trusting their own perceptions and reactions. So when clients say things like, I never know what's expected of me, or I can't do anything right, we often find that double binds are operating within their family system. And so if you look on the screen to the left, there's a list of some more examples, but these kind of double binds show up in any kind of system. There's not just family systems, systems or any situation where groups of people are working together. And so even in at work. So the work scenario example here is an employee is encouraged to be independent and decisive, but is criticized for not seeking approval. And I've also heard, on the flip side, okay, make sure you run this by me, make sure you get this and that approved. But then when you seek that approval, you might get told, well, I can't hold your hand for everything. I really need you to be, more of a self-starter. So it's like, there's really no winning in that situation. So, but they show up everywhere in systems, and you can see it in body language and tone. Tone is a big one in the work I do with clients. Is someone says something with their words, but their tone is communicating something else, and so you're not really sure how to respond, right? How to be responsive to that person. So that is the concept of double binds, and it creates a lot of distress. All right, so the next concept is the beginning of systems theory. So, the way research works is when something's new, you have to pull from old ideas that may not be counseling because this is new, right? So you think about those names I mentioned early, Jay Haley, Virginia Satir at the Palo Alto Group and the Mental Research Institute. They were doing all this groundbreaking new research on family therapy. They were pulling from um, they were pulling from anthropology, they were pulling from communications, they were pulling from all these other ideas. So one of them was systems theory. This is where it enters the picture. So Ludwig von something another, I don't know how to say that, but he was an anthropologist who developed system theories in the 1940s. Again, not a counselor, not a family counselor, an anthropologist. Now, his systems theory proposed that systems are made up of interrelated parts and that you cannot fully understand one part without understanding the whole. So, if you'll see on your screen, there is a picture of a lot of car parts. And it's everything that's needed to make a car, but that is not a car. You could not drive that, even though all the parts are there. So the parts have to work together and sing in harmony, right? They have to be put together functionally to make the car go. So that comes to one of the most important concepts of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? This is leads me into talking about cybernetics. So Gregory Bateson is another person who was pulled, who the researchers pulled from their work. Gregory Bateson later applied this thinking to families using cybernetics, which is the study of communication and feedback loops on both machines and living systems. So, one of the most important ideas from systems theories is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You can't drive those car parts around. You can only drive a car, which is the parts put together appropriately and functionally. So, when something changes in one part of the system, the entire system reacts. So, again, going along with this car metaphor, if your transmission is out, you can't, the whole car you can't drive it, right? You can't really do much with it. And another part is systems use feedback. They use feedback to remain stable. So I've got a picture of a dash there, like a car dash with all the lights. And so when you enter that car to drive it, you become part of that operating system. And so say you're driving it and the feedback you'll get is maybe your low fuel light comes on. So that is a cue to you to go refill the gas tank so that you can continue driving the car in a functional way. The car continues to move forward. So that is you being responsive to the feedback from the car. So that's just a metaphor of feedback. And when you think about it in terms of family, okay, so maybe there's a big dust up in the family, and if is the injured party able to communicate to the family, hey, this really is hurting me, and is the family able to rally around and respond to that family member and repair and get the family back into their homeostasis, right? To get back to that level of functioning and safety. And so that is using feedback and being responsive. The same way as if your check engine light comes on, you've got to get it into the mechanic, right? Otherwise, the car's gonna maybe eventually break down and not work. So that's the metaphor, cars, families, right? So I mentioned homeostasis. So homeostasis refers to the system's tendency to to maintain stability. And so families often resist change, not because change is bad, but because stability feels so much safer. Even unhealthy patterns can feel predictable and therefore very comforting. So that's why therapy can feel very disruptive. When one person begins to change, the system often pushes back in order to restore balance. And so it's like a thermostat, once you blow this cold, you're trying to cool the house down and you blow this cold air. And then when it finally gets to 70 degrees, it says 75. I'm trying to get to 70, really 68 if we're being real talk. But you're blowing out the cold air, and then when it gets to the desired temperature, the thermostat cuts off because that's the homeostasis. Now, if it warms up, that air conditioner is going to kick back on to get it back to homeostasis. We're trying to keep it at one temperature, right? And in therapy, we're trying to change the temperature of the family. And families really get uncomfortable with that. And so, a really clear example of this is working with addictions. So if you've got someone who's struggling with an addiction and they get treatment and they get sober and they get cleaned up, that can be really hard for the family, especially when maybe a parent's role has always been to caretake. Well, now they don't really know how to relate to this child because the child is well. And so that's when you can see some of these enabling behaviors come in because that's where they're trying to get back to homeostasis, even though it's not healthy or um, necessarily good for the family, but it's what's familiar and therefore that's what's safe. So that's what you're fighting against is homeostasis and trying to change that set point. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, other names to know. Okay. So there are several foundational figures we're going to encounter throughout this course. Jay Haley is associated with strategic family therapy. Salvador Minuchin is associated with structural family therapy. Virginia Satir and Carl Whitaker are experiential approaches. I love Virginia Satir. She's so interesting. And I love that we have a female theorist, foundational theorists that are usually all male, right? And then Murray Bowen developed Bowenian family therapy. That's going to be easy to remember because it's in the name. And Bowenian is where we'll talk about genograms and all that kind of good stuff. So, you don't need to master these theories yet, just know they're in the pipeline. For now, just simply begin associating names with different ways of thinking about families. And you've already taken theories, so you know that these theories, just like any other theories, they're going to have more overlap than differences. And it's, kind of drives you nuts sometimes trying to keep it all straight, but um, we'll get into those in the coming weeks, and it should be a lot of fun. I think it's fun. Okay, so those are kind of our big theorists, classical theorists coming up. All right, so some more important basics. This slide contains some of the most important ideas in family therapy. So in family therapy, the relationship is the client. We often talk about the identified patient, the person who presents with the symptoms, the person who's bringing the family into therapy. A lot of times it's going to start out as an individual client or student, but we do not assume that that person is the problem. We distinguish between the presenting problem and the processes that maintain the problem. So the content refers to what the families talk about, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. The process is the underlying how. How did we get here? And a lot of times that how goes back multiple generations of how we got here. How do we get here? How do we talk to each other about the problems? How do we maintain these patterns? That's the deeper work that we're doing as counselors, no matter what we're doing. The content, we can't get too wrapped up in content. We've got to really get to process when we can. So, and what we see in session is just the tip of the iceberg oftentimes. All right, so the next thing, let me take a sip of tea here because I'm talking a lot. All right, the next thing I want you to understand is that the parts of a system are interconnected. Nothing in family systems happens in isolation. So when one person changes, everyone else must adjust, even if they do not want to. And that's why individual change can feel threatening to a family system. And so the illustration here is a picture of a little baby mobile. You know, the little cute things that you hang above a crib that little babies kind of look at and bad at or whatever. And so if you're looking at this one, this is a little bird surrounding a cloud. And if you were to grab one of those birds and kind of flick it or fling it, the whole thing is going to shake and wiggle and wobble, and every single thing, piece and part on that mobile is going to move, is going to be affected. So that is just an illustration of how a change in an individual is going to ripple throughout their family, throughout their system. And that can be challenging and feel unsafe sometimes. All right, so parts of a system are interconnected. All right, the next thing is the family life cycle. So this image represents what we call the family life cycle, which is a foundational concept in family counseling. So the family life cycle helps us understand that families are not static. They are constantly evolving, and each stage of the cycle brings predictable developmental tasks, transitions, and stressors. So, flashback to your lifespan development class, we looked at individual development. This is looking kind of at the same thing, but in terms of family, right, and systems. And one of the pillars of counseling is development. And so we believe people change and grow and develop. And this is just one piece of that is the family life cycle. So importantly, distress in families often shows up when a family is struggling to move from one stage to the next, or when a transition happens unexpected or prematurely, such as, like a death or a divorce or so things like that. So we're going to start at the top, leaving home. So the cycle often begins with leaving home. Now, you may not go through all of these as an adult, and that's fine. That's okay. Everybody has their own path. But you've been through most of these as a child because everyone's been a child, right? So, all right. So we're going to start at the top though, leaving with home. And a lot of you are in your early mid 20s and you've just kind of gone through this transition. You might still be in the middle of it, especially since you're still in school, and that's completely normal, right? This stage involves differentiation, and that's a term we'll talk about in chapter 5. But really, that just means young adults separating emotionally and practically from their family of origin. And so the key task here is balancing independence while maintaining connection. So families that struggle at this stage may experience enmeshment, guilt, or difficulty letting go. I remember going through this too, when I graduated high school and went to college, and that was a tough transition. And I remember my grandmother, y'all know she raised me, I told you that. She and I were getting in a lot of arguments my senior year, and I saw a counselor, and she pointed out to me sometimes we get in fights with our parents during this time of life transition because it makes it easier to say goodbye. And that really made a lot of sense to me. So that's that stage of the family life cycle. So we're moving on. Marriage. So next is marriage or the formation of a committed partnership. And again, this is not one size fits all. This is just kind of this model that we're talking about here. So this stage requires creating a new primary system when loyalty shifts from family of origin to the couple relationship. So boundaries must be renegotiated, roles are defined, and patterns are established. So like, where are we going to spend the holidays, for example, right? So conflict often arises when extended family remains overly influential. So they're not really kind of letting you differentiate as much, and that's when you'll see kind of some arguments and things. All right, so the next one is families with young children. So when children enter the system, the family moves into the stage of families with young children, and this is a major reorganization. The couple subsystem must make room for the parenting subsystem. We'll learn about subsystems in chapter 5, but I think you can kind of, context clues can kind of understand. You go from being a couple to now you're a couple, but you're also parents, right? In your identity. So you got to make room for that. And some common stressors include sleep deprivation, role overload, and shifts in intimacy and what that looks like for the couple. So, from a systems perspective, symptoms in children often reflect strain in the parental or couple relationship. I'm going to say that again because a lot of you are going to graduate and work with children. Symptoms in children often reflect strain in the parental or couple relationship. And so I even have an example of that. I'm seeing a couple right now in my side practice where they were referred to me by a play therapist because Even though that play therapist works with individual children in play therapy, she had the knowledge and understanding that the parents' conflict are causing distress in the children. And if the parents can kind of get their stuff situated and figured out, then that's going to be to the benefit of the children. And she's right. There are some things we're working on that I think are going to really benefit the kids also. So it all works together, right? We're all connected. All right, so next is families with adolescents, and they face a different challenge, and that is flexibility. That's the main one because adolescents need increased autonomy while parents must loosen control without losing connection, right? It's always a balance between separation and togetherness. This stage it often brings conflict, power struggles, and renegotiation of rules, right? It wouldn't make sense to have, you're 16 and you're living under the same rules you had when you were 10. That doesn't make sense. Families that rely on rigid control may struggle here, while families that adapt tend to fare better. So, flexibility is really going to help you in your family. So then the next stage is launching children. So the launching stage involves children leaving the home. So this can trigger grief, identity shifts, and marital strain. Parents are asked to redefine themselves beyond active parenting roles, and couples often reconnect or confront unresolved issues. I'm working with a couple now who they're kind of looking at, the only thing we have in common right now is our child. And once our child graduates and leaves, what are we going to do? What are we even going to talk about, right? And so that's kind of why they came in for couples counseling. And that's valid. That's fair. All right. So then the next stage is families in later life. And finally, it focuses this stage focuses on meaning, legacy, and adaptation to loss. And this may include retirement, health changes, caregiving, or the death of loved ones. And the task here is maintaining connection while adapting to changing abilities and roles. And I think what in my work I've seen one of the most stressed populations is the sandwich generation. And so I think we talked about that in lifespan development, but it's an online class, easy to forget some of those little things. But the sandwich generation are middle-aged people who are taking care of children in their home, and they're also having to take care of aging or disabled parents. And then not only that, when you get in middle age, that's when your career is typically the most demanding and overwhelming. So there's so much stress coming from so many different directions when people are in this kind of caregiving role and they're trying to balance that with a career and pay all their bills and live, do all that stuff. So I just think that's important to know. You got to paint the whole picture of your clients and that's important to remember. But anyway. All right, so where are we at? So, from a family therapy perspective, the key takeaway is this: problems often emerge not because families are dysfunctional, but because they are stuck between stages of the life cycle. So, understanding where a family is or where they are stuck helps us to contextualize symptoms and normalize stress, kind of like what I was saying earlier. Okay, so that's the life cycle. All right, so now our textbook uses the case study approach because theory becomes clearer when we can see it in action. And I want to tell you, chapter one, the first case study is Cinderella. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize my first read through that that was Cinderella. Y'all probably caught on a lot quicker than I did. But, let's talk about Cinderella. So the first case study in our textbook because it gives us a surprisingly clear illustration of family systems concepts. So when we look at Cinderella through a family counseling lens, we stop asking why is Cinderella so passive or sad, and instead start asking what kind of family system is she living in, right? From a genogram perspective, we immediately notice significant losses, and I apologize I couldn't flesh out this genogram here as much as I would have liked to because it was an image from Google, but it's Cinderella's kind of genogram. And if it was fleshed out, it would show the deaths. It would have X's through, her mom and dad, and it would have the dates that she lost them so that we could see, and it would have her birth dates so that we could see her age and developmental level when she had these significant losses. But we would see those losses of her mother early on and then later her father. Um, and those losses are not just individual traumas, but they fundamentally reorganize the family system. So the stepmother enters the system with her own children, and what we see emerge is a rigid hierarchy. I know y'all have seen Cinderella, right? Power is centralized with the stepmother, Boundaries are extremely rigid, and Cinderella is pushed into the role of the outsider, or what we might consider the identified patient. So, in the family system, Cinderella carries the emotional and practical burden of the household. She absorbs the neglect and the hostility and the inequality, while the stepsisters, they're just protected and reinforced by the system. So, from a systems perspective, Cinderella's suffering actually helps to stabilize the family. Her role maintains homeostasis by allowing the stepmother and stepsisters to avoid their own insecurities and conflicts and housework. So, if we were drawing this genogram, we would note disrupted attachment bonds, unresolved grief, power imbalances, and the clear coalition patterns, especially that alliance between the stepmother and her biological daughters, and how that, negatively impacts Cinderella. So, what's important here is that Cinderella does not need to be fixed. The problem is not her personality, it's the relational system that she's trapped in. And so, this is exactly the kind of thinking family therapy asks us to practice, understanding how symptoms, roles, and distress make sense within the context of a larger system. So, hopefully, that makes sense. Cinderella. All right, so here's another family, right? This is going to be our case study for the next 5 chapters. This Is Us gives us a rich example of family systems at work across generations. And at different times, different family members function as the identified patient. So we'll see Kate, Randall, Kevin, they all kind of shift roles and positions. But the distress never belongs to just one person, it's a systemic issue. So we see grief shaping family roles, we see unspoken rules about emotion, we see powerful intergenerational patterns. And when we watch This Is Us through the lens of a family counseling fundamentals, we to ask systemic questions like what patterns are repeating and who carries emotional responsibility and how does the family respond to change and loss. So this is exactly the kind of thinking we want to develop as family therapists. And this link here is going to take us, I think it's a summary of the first episode of This Is Us. We'll watch it together, but I want you to watch the episode in its entirety so we can discuss it in class and start kind of throwing these ideas around. You don't have to have any perfect, right, correct, groundbreaking answers. I just want you to bring your curiosity and your thinking cap, right? So this is us. Don't forget to watch that episode before class. And the takeaways, family therapy focuses on patterns, not blame. I want you to know that. And symptoms make sense in context. And relationships have the power to harm, but also to heal. You can heal in relationship. That's what EFT is all about. Well, I can't wait to talk about EFT. Um, and so when we get together, I do want to know what you hope to learn this semester and what your thoughts are, after you've read this chapter and kind of listened to this lecture and everything. So let's move on to reminders and to-dos. Be sure to complete the assigned readings, that Murdoch chapter 1. It's an easy read. Watch the assigned episode of This Is Us. It's just the first episode of the first season, and then come to class prepared to think systemically. You don't need perfect answers, just curiosity. That's all I ask of you. So, thank you for listening to my lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class and talking more about this stuff.